Hi guys, welcome back to the Curly Reader. So today we're going to talk about all the books that I read during the month of August. August was not a particularly good reading month for me. At the beginning of the month, I read several middle grade graphic novels and I wrapped those up in a separate video and I will link that down below. But other than that, I read 7 books, one of which was either YA or adult, I'm not quite sure which, graphic novel. And so I completed 6 print or full-length novels, whatever you want to call it. I also ended up DNFing 2 books this month, so it just wasn't super great, but it was fine. I still, made some progress towards some of the goals that I had set for myself for the year, so we're counting it as progress. Progress, not perfection, right? So anyway, I thought I would talk with you first about the 2 books that I ended up DNFing. The first of which was All the Light We Cannot See by Anthony Doerr, and this was on my reading the 5 oldest books on my TBR challenge that I'm doing for myself. So that's kind of a little sneak peek to that, but I ended up DNFing this one. I made it about that far through it. I made it about 5 hours into the audiobook and I was so bored. So bored. To the point where I don't think it was necessarily the audiobook, it was just the content of the book, because I tried getting into just the print version of it and it was just so boring. And I hate that because I've heard great things about this book. A lot of people have absolutely loved it. It just was not for me. The writing style was just very slow, very, very slow and very dry. And yeah. So unfortunately, that one just did not work out for me. The other one, and this is a World War II historical fiction, and it follows a blind French little girl and a German boy who likes working on radios. And I have no idea how they end up intersecting. I never made it to that point, but that's what it's about. The other one that I ended up DNFing is The Zookeepers Wife by Diane Ackerman. And this is one that I had hauled from a thrift store a while ago, and I've been trying to pick up more books from my physical shelf. And so this is one that I decided I was going to read. And I didn't realize, first of all, I did not realize that this is straight up nonfiction. I thought it was historical fiction. So that threw me off a little bit. And then the other thing with this is that while the story and the premise is good, the author, throughout telling the stories, goes off on like really long tangents about random things. There's sections about bugs. There's sections about, I don't know, like Polish food. There's a lot about different kinds of animals, obviously, because she was a zookeeper. But she would just like go off on all these random like rabbit trails, and it was really hard to follow the main storyline. And so I ended up DNFing this one at about 75% through because I was enjoying the story of it. I just wasn't enjoying reading about all the really detailed other stuff. And so I ended up going to my library and grabbing the movie of this and watching it, and it was fine. It was an okay movie. I think it was a little anticlimactic in my opinion, but it is what it is. This follows the story of it's Jan and Antonina Zabinski, and they live in Warsaw, Poland, and they are the zookeeper and the zookeeper's wife of the Polish zoo in Warsaw. And during World War II, the zoo is forced to close down, and they end up hiding Jews throughout the zoo and in their home in order to protect them and save them. And they kind of act as almost like a halfway house where where Jan would go into the ghetto and get the Jews and bring them into their home until they could find somewhere else for them to go. And they ended up saving over 300 people during the war, and the zoo is still open today. So it reopened after the war and it's still open today. And it was a great story. I think this would make a really great historical fiction novel. This is not it though. So anyway, I just didn't feel like I was going to gain anything else by finishing reading the book. I figured I could just watch the movie and get what I wanted out of it. So that's why I DNF'd that. That was a lot of words for a very little amount of information. All right. So outside of my 2 DNFs, I'm just going to go through these in the order that I read them. So the first book that I read this month was Atomic City Girls. I read this for my book club that I have in real life. And this is another World War II historical fiction, and it follows one of the areas kind of like the Manhattan Project, but it was the one in Nashville, Tennessee, and now I cannot for the life of me remember what it was called. But it follows this girl that works there in one of the offices there, and she gets into a relationship with one of the guys, and it just kind of follows it. It was fine. It wasn't anything great. There really wasn't a whole lot of plot. It didn't really go anywhere. I ended up giving it 3 stars because I did enjoy learning about the facility and what they were doing, and them working with plutonium and trying to make the bomb and all of that. But yeah, so it was great, but 3-star read, nothing fantastic. I then listened to Maybe in Another Life by Taylor Jenkins Reid. I ended up giving this one 4 stars. I have since done a completely separate video going through all of the things that Taylor Jenkins Reid has written. And so I talk more in depth about this book in that video. But for those of you who are unfamiliar with her works, Maybe in Another Life is the story of a girl who moves back to Los Angeles from New York. And one night she's out, she runs into her like high school sweetheart boyfriend, and he asks if she wants to go home with him. I think that, or if he wants to take her home or something like that. Anyway, and that's kind of the splitting off point. And at that point, the book kind of goes in 2 different routes. One storyline you're following is if she says yes, and one storyline you're following is if she says no. And so they run kind of parallel. So each chapter you're bouncing back and forth from storyline to storyline. It's not that confusing, despite how it sounds. And yeah, it's really good. I really, really enjoyed it. I gave it 4 stars. But you can hear more about that in my Taylor Jenkins Reid video, which I will also leave linked down below. All right, after that one, I listened to Josh and Hazel's Guide to Not Dating by Christina Lauren. Christina Lauren is one of those authors who has been super hyped, I feel like, on BookTube. A lot of people really, really love her books. And so this was one, I was just kind of looking for something to read, and I was going through my library's audiobook selection and what was available now, and I was like, we'll see if anything by Christina Lauren's available, and that was one that was, so I decided to listen to it. And I wasn't the biggest fan of it. It was okay. It was much steamier. Yeah, we'll go with that. Than what I typically read. I typically don't read a lot of like sex scene stuff that goes like really into it. So it's definitely a little bit steamier. I also, because I listened to it, there were 2 different narrators. You get Josh and Hazel both. And while the female narrator was fine, the male narrator for this was awful. So bad. Every time he was narrating and you were like saying what the voices he did for girls or children were so bad. It was just almost laughable. So there's that. But yeah, it just wasn't quite the book for me. I have since listened to some other things and I have quite enjoyed them. So that's for another day though. But anyway, so that was another just 3-star read for me. I then finished reading Betsy and Joe by Maud Hart Lovelace. This is part of the Betsy Tacy series, which I'm trying to get through this year. I'm still pretty behind on it, but I'm making progress. And Betsy and Joe is the 8th book in the series. And so it's Betsy's senior year of high school, and it's just kind of about her and Joe, who has been a character in all of the high school books. And you kind of know that they've always been meant to be, and so now they're kind of finally getting together. And I really enjoyed this one. I gave it 4 stars. There was a section of it that was just kind of filler. I feel like it wasn't really important to the story, but it was fine. And then after that, I read If You Want to Make God Laugh by Bianca Murray. This one, I did a complete book review, book spotlight video on it that goes quite in depth on the way I feel about this book. I really, really enjoyed this book. I read Bianca Murray's other book, Hum If You Don't Know the Words, earlier this year and loved it. And I still stand by the fact that I really, really like Bianca Murray's writing style. I like the way that she is able to write sentences, is artwork. It is just beautiful. And I didn't like this one as much as her previous one, but I still really, really enjoyed it. Briefly, this is the story of three different women in the 1990s in South Africa, two older white women and one younger black woman. And it's right after apartheid. Nelson Mandela was just elected president, and it just kind of follows them. They're each kind of in a moment of crisis in their life, and they all of their stories kind of come together. But this talks a lot about racism. It talks about HIV/AIDS. It talks about rape culture, faith. I mean, there's just a whole slew of things that this talks about, and it was fantastic. So yeah, I ended up giving this one 4 stars. After that, I read Out of the Easy by Ruta Sepetys. This is another one that was on my summer TBR. Ruta Sepetys has a new book coming out this fall, and so I wanted to read. This is the last book of hers that I needed to read to have completed her entire backlist before her new book comes out. And so I was able to finally complete this. This is the story of Josie. This is the story of Josie, who lives in New Orleans in the 1950s, and her mother is a prostitute. That's like the first line of the book is, my mother is a prostitute. And it was a very good first chapter, I will say, of the book. But it just kind of follows her. She wants to get out of New Orleans. How does she get out from under the life that her mother has kind of brought her up in? And yeah, and so it was good. This is definitely my least favorite of all of the Ruta Sepetys books that I've read. I will say this one, you can tell that this was her debut novel. It was just a little clunky, in my opinion. For example, throughout the book, she constantly references the street names of where she is. And you can tell, like, she went to New Orleans and she did her research. And she was trying to throw those things in to make it, relatable, I guess, like if you're familiar with New Orleans. But it was constantly, I walked up this street to this street, and then I went to this street. And I just felt like for most people, that was not needed. The characters were okay. They weren't the best. There were some great scenes in this book, but overall it was just 3 stars for me. I didn't think it was necessarily as good as her other 2 books. And then to finish out the month, I read a graphic novel, and that is March Book 1 by John Lewis. And this is a memoir, a graphic memoir by John Lewis. He is currently, I don't know if he is still, but he was, when he wrote this, a congressman, but he was a huge participator in the civil rights movement in the 1960s. And so this is his story about that. And it's kind of neat because the way it starts off is he's going to Barack Obama's induction. Yeah, he's going to Barack Obama's induction, and he wakes up, and when he gets to the office, I'm trying to see if I can find the page. When he gets to the office, this mom brings her like 2 teenage sons in, and he starts telling them about his story and where he grew up and why he started getting into the civil rights movement and what really drove him to participate in that. And I loved this. I thought it was so well done. This is one, I have no idea if this is meant to be YA or adult. It's shelved in the teen section in my library. It's appropriate for teens, but I think that the content is just as appropriate for adults. This is definitely an example of kind of, I don't really know where to shelve it sort of thing. But this was fantastic, and I'm really, really looking forward to continuing. There are 3 books out of this, and I am hoping to get through the next 2 books here in the next couple of months. So those are all of the books that I read during the month of August. Like I said, not a fantastic reading month, but not awful either. Um, if you have read any of these books, I'd love to hear your thoughts and opinions down below as always. I love connecting with you down in the comments. And other than that, I hope that you enjoyed this and I hope that you stick around and subscribe. And until next time, see ya.